Well, we're getting to that point of the year again where everyone starts celebrating the end of October for various reasons. And given the month and all that, I thought it might be a bit of fun to do a video focused on the horror genre. But seeing as every man and his dog is covering horror games, I figured I'd do something a little bit different, and take a look at the times that horror showed up in what's otherwise non-horror titles. I mean, the stuff that usually ends up being the scariest is always the stuff that catches you off guard, right? Like when you get that tax bill from the government at the end of the financial year, or seeing what your mum looks like the morning after when she's in broad daylight. And I'm talking intentional stuff too, not perceived or interpreted stuff. Like the kind that people come up with when they're trying to convince themselves that Super Mario 64 is somehow some kind of existential horror game. Anyway, having said all that, let's get into it.
Just give me a few moments to get my equipment ready, and then come on in and we'll get started.
Right, so first up is an all-time classic with Batman Arkham Asylum. Something which not only kicked off the whole Arkham franchise, which they're still making games for, but also one that reminded us that the Batman games could actually be good if they were made properly. The premise of this one was pretty simple. After apprehending Joker for the bazillionth time, Batman ends up getting trapped in Arkham Asylum after the place goes in lockdown.
Welcome to the madhouse, Batman!
All apparently part of Joker's big plan.
Because it's all part of the plan.
Then having to explore various wings of the asylum bit by bit, as he acquires new gadgets and punches or kicks in the teeth of every inmate who's dumb enough to get in his way. The whole thing is an all-time classic and really one of the best superhero games ever made.
So what was it that gave it away?
But also one that you'd hardly associate with horror, which is why the infamous Scarecrow sequences seem to work so well. So at a point in the story when you're pretty much getting used to that basic gameplay loop, going around and punching people in the face or taking them out from the shadows, you suddenly get to this section where you come across the apparent dead body of Commissioner Gordon.
I'm sorry, Jim.
With there being nothing else to seemingly do, you check out the nearby corridors, where it then starts to become clear that something isn't right. Before then ending up in the morgue, which appears to be a bit of a dead end. So you try to leave the morgue, only to find yourself right back at the entrance.
Oh, shit.
The world's greatest detective then investigates a couple of writhing body bags, only to find the slightly decomposed corpses of his parents inside.
Should have stood up to him, son.
Then after opening the third one, we get a very effective jump scare as Scarecrow first appears. Before the game then seamlessly transitions into this kind of horrific nightmare world, where Scarecrow's now this giant skulking predator that Batman's got to avoid, whilst also fighting reanimated skeletons along the way. And the whole thing's a really good sequence, simply because Batman as a superhero is really broken down into those two main elements. He's got his physical capabilities and then his intellect, or his mind.
Oracle, I'm on Dr. Young's trail.
So when you put him into some kind of a situation where neither of those really have any meaning anymore, it instantly makes the guy feel more vulnerable. And being caught in Scarecrow's gaze here actually ends up being a frightening predicament.
Stay still, this won't hurt.
This actually happens a few times throughout the game as well, and they're all really effective sequences, reminding us that Batman's still carrying around quite a bit of trauma.
Please, there's no need for this. Stay where you are. I'll give you whatever you want.
Without a doubt, the best bit though is when the game fake crashes and then replays that intro cinematic. As if the whole thing shit itself and sets you back to the beginning of the game. And truly, there is nothing scarier in gaming than the premise of having your save file corrupted and all of your progress lost.
Fucking A.
Oh, hold on.
They did try to do a sort of similar thing in Arkham City, with a sequence where Batman's kidnapped by the Mad Hatter. But this short sequence in Arkham Asylum is without a doubt the absolute highlight. And in a game that is so well loved for multiple reasons, this bit right here is still a standout. Up next is one of the most iconic and well-known titles in Sega's Mega Drive library, and that's Ecco the Dolphin. Yeah, 1992 saw the release of games like Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Streets of Rage 2, Alien 3, and Splatterhouse. And then to top it all off, we've got Ecco the Dolphin. where you swim around the vast ocean rescuing your buddies after an alien abduction. I mean, that's pretty much the plot. I mean, like, in its defense, it is a pretty unique concept, but there is a reason why you don't see that many games that let you play as a dolphin. Simply put, because it's just kinda lame.
Fucking A.
Oh, hold on.
Anyway, if you were anything like me back then, you got bored after like 2 or 3 levels in, where you were already having to navigate these confusing mazes and manage a constantly dwindling air supply that made it seem as if Echo had emphysema. So what did you do back in the 90s when you got stuck in a video game and couldn't figure out how to progress? Well, you whipped out your favourite gaming magazine to see if it had any cheat codes, which in Echo's case it did, with all the level codes for the entire game. Then jumping right ahead to that end boss, because why the hell not, to suddenly find yourself in this black void fighting a giant disembodied alien head. Yeah, because remember those aliens in the opening sequence that kidnapped all the sea life? Well, this thing right here is responsible for all of it. Considering before this you were swimming through sunny reefs and taking on sharks and jellyfish, to suddenly come up against this humongous alien monstrosity resulted in some pretty savage tonal whiplash. And those few moments where you can actually get a decent look at it is the stuff that bad dreams are made of. But what's even kind of scarier is that if you're killed during this fight, you don't actually restart from the beginning of the stage. Now, instead what the game does is throw you back to the preceding level, the infamous Welcome to the Machine, which is without a doubt one of the all-time most difficult levels I think in any video game ever made. This is one set against a constantly scrolling background you gotta navigate, trying to both learn the route but also avoiding enemies who are gonna attack you off the sides of the screen. And I still remember renting this thing out with my friend in school at the time, and the two of us sitting there with his younger brother for what felt like hours trying to unsuccessfully get past this. I mean, even if we did, it wouldn't have mattered because we would have been finished off seconds later by that final boss anyway, and then just thrown right back to the beginning.
Welcome to hell, motherfucker!
The difficulty of these last few stages in Ecco the Dolphin is absolutely legendary, and I don't know anyone who was able to beat this game without cheating. And it could have been a really unique and enjoyable title for the platform, but it just has incredibly cryptic puzzles and level layouts, which really is kind of tone deaf considering the game was made for a console that was played mostly by kids. Still though, the whole thing seemed to sell pretty well regardless, but ultimately the real horror just comes from the wasted potential and what this game could have truly been. Fallout 3 is one of those games that really seems like it could be horror based just on the premise alone. Taking place in the future after a nuclear war has decimated the planet, you're playing as a vault dweller, venturing out into the radiated wasteland of civilization after having lived inside an underground vault your entire life. Now having to avoid hostile humans as well as horrific mutants and other nightmarish creatures. But outside of the pants-shittingly terrifying sight of a deathclaw charging towards you, Fallout 3 was mostly devoid of anything remotely scary.
Put up a fight!
That is, of course, unless you happen to come across the infamous Dunwich building. Now, what's great about this one is that when Fallout 3 first came out, YouTube and internet culture really wasn't as much of a thing back then. I mean, if this had have come out nowadays, there would have been people posting all about it on Twitter, or making a video about it, ruining the fun that people would have had by finding this organically and on their own. But back in 2008 though, most people would have innocently come across this building none the wiser, just assuming it was going to be another fun little area to plunder for resources. And when you first enter, nothing really seems out of the ordinary. You know, it just seems like another abandoned building that's been overrun with feral ghouls. But then you start to slowly notice that things are a little bit off, with this bizarre ambient noise in the background that almost kind of sounds like whispering or chanting. Along with finding the scattered audio logs of someone named Jamie who's also explored the building at some point in the past. where it soon becomes pretty obvious that the guy's been infected and is slowly turning into a ghoul himself.
Play and say my words. Abdul comes again on the feast of the weaker.
It's when you get to the basement though that the whole thing gets really weird, with there being this bizarre monument beneath the building, adorned with human skulls and an even creepier murmuring that outright feels like it's some kind of tribute to an unseen cosmic horror. And I think what I appreciate the most about all of this is that none of this stuff is ever explained. Like, you never get a concrete explanation for what the hell's even going on here. All up, I think it's easily one of the most memorable locations in Fallout 3, and one that definitely caught players off guard. Still though, the scariest thing about it is that when I went back in there to check it out again for this video, I had to fight not one, not two, but 3 fucking feral ghoul reavers. Yeah, and the hit that took on my stim pack supply was the scariest thing of all. Now when we're talking about all-time classic video games, you can't go past the original Max Payne. A game that's not only known for helping to popularise the whole bullet time mechanic, but also one with really captivating and unique writing, with a high focus on storytelling and those unique comic book style panels really being the driving force behind the narrative.
You're killing me. Did you make that up yourselves, or you get some wino downstairs to come up with it?
For the most part though, otherwise it was pretty much just a standard shooter, where you blasted your way through a bunch of realistic environments, taking on various kinds of criminals and corrupt government employees, trying to get to the bottom of a conspiracy that's caused the death of Max's wife and kid. And without a doubt, the most infamous levels in the game were those couple of nightmare sequences which served as interludes between the main chapters. The whole thing's like basically a projection of Max's inner torment, forcing him to navigate through this mental labyrinth which really emphasized the pain and trauma this guy was hanging on to. When I was younger, like, this stuff didn't really affect me that much, but ever since getting married and having a kid of my own, I really find these sequences way more disturbing. And it totally makes sense that the guy who had both his wife and infant daughter brutally murdered is gonna carry around a lot of emotional baggage. I mean, I get it, man, like, I'd have fucked up nightmares too.
Max, is that you?
Just perfectly captures that feeling of the weird, surreal state of lucid dreaming, where you're trapped inside this horrifying reality and unable to wake up. And if that ain't enough, you've also got the sound of his wife screaming in the background and the constant wailing of his baby daughter. I mean, yeah, it's messed up. Probably the most horrifying thing about this though is the platforming. Now during the first nightmare, all you've got to do is follow these linear corridors and blood trails, which is simple enough. But during the second one, you've also got to jump across what's more or less invisible gaps, as well as dropping down an entire level to another series of these things below. And I still have PTSD about trying to get through this area on that crappy PS2 port. As a result, the gameplay aspect of these chapters can seem a bit dated by today's standards. In fact, Remedy even seemed to pick up on this as well, more or less removing these kind of platforming areas from the sequel. Either way though, this whole sequence is still a chilling window into the psyche of a man who really did have nothing to lose. And it's always going to stick out as one of the darker moments in the entire franchise, especially when you compare it to some of the stuff we got in Max Payne 3. Now, the Metal Gear Solid series has always had its fair share of frightening and unsettling moments, like in MGS1 with the whole sequence involving the ninja and that B2 corridor, in MGS2 towards the end when you're inside Arsenal Gear, and you keep getting these codec calls from the Colonel which become more and more unhinged.
Infiltrate the enemy fortress. Outer heaven.
And even in MGS4 after each fight against the members of the BB unit, where you could hear some really creepy sounds as their various forms of PTSD started to manifest in the area. But Metal Gear Solid 3 is really the only game that has a full-on sequence dedicated to frightening the player during the boss fight against the Sorrow, if I can even call it a boss fight. Described as a spirit medium soldier, the Sorrow was a former member of the Cobra unit who could apparently communicate with the dead, more importantly, dead soldiers. which is why it's only at that point when Snake's knocking on Death's door that he's able to interact with this guy in the first place.
I am the Sorrow.
My name is Jeff.
And it's just such a cool little sequence, really showing the kind of unique and creative stuff that Hideo Kojima used to come up with when he was making games. And as well as just being interesting from a visual standpoint, this whole encounter serves as a way of holding the player accountable for their actions up until that point.
Now you will know the sorrow of those whose lives you have ended.
Because if you spent the last few hours going around murdering everything that moves, well, then the river you're walking down is going to be populated with the tormented souls of those you've killed. But if you've gone full pacifist mode, then it's going to be a lovely, relaxing saunter down what's more or less the River of the Dead. Either way though, this is still a pretty damn memorable sequence, and the whole thing's so out of left field. It also offers up what's really the only jump scare in the entire game, where if you're hit by the Sorrow's projectile, you get this ghostly image flashing up on the screen, along with most of your health being drained off in an instant. And I think that out of all the things that Big Boss should probably get counselling over, this thing right here is definitely got to be up there. Still though, as scary as the whole thing is, the most frightening thing in the entire MGS series is always going to be the updated voice acting we got in the Twin Snakes.
Gray Fox!
I mean, that stuff still gives me chills to this day.
Hey! Shut up in there, will ya?
Next up is Rugrats Search for Reptar. Yeah, a game that again you wouldn't really associate with horror, but is actually one of the first ones that came to mind when I first started putting this script together. Simply because throughout the years I've seen a whole lot of people online saying that this game absolutely scared the shit out of them. Recently, a lot of that comes from the argument that it has some kind of liminal space feel to it, and that the absence of any adult NPCs somehow makes it feel empty and surreal. Honestly, I think that's just people looking for something to be scared by, which is doubly silly because the game literally has instances when it is blatantly trying to scare the player, and these are far worse. And despite most of it being pretty harmless, including activities like an Easter egg hunt, doing laps around the backyard with Spike, or eating cookies, there is stuff in this game which really does feel like it's just been thrown in here to fuck with the player. Like this whole level where Grandpa's teeth get stolen and Tommy and Chucky have to go find them inside this maze, which just happens to be full of incredibly aggressive geese that attack them on sight. At one point, one of these things more or less kidnaps Chucky, and you've got to chase after him as Tommy before it can get away.
Help, Tommy, help!
And honestly, like, if this kind of thing happened to a toddler in reality, it would absolutely scar them for life, causing some kind of deep-seated trauma they'd probably carry into adulthood. There's another level where these two get stuck inside a toy store at night time and all the toys start to come to life and chase after them.
Tommy?
Yeah, again, another childhood memory that would be one of the many things brought up during therapy. Then you got the weirdest one where Tommy gets sucked into a mirror and ends up in Mirrorland.
Uh-oh.
Which is like an alternate reality taking place inside an inverted version of the Pickles house, where the whole place is flipped upside down and all the furniture is on the ceiling. And this stuff right here is like some flat out Salvador Dali MC Escher kind of shit, where you gotta navigate this bizarre dreamlike space to collect a bunch of balloons. At one point, Tommy even comments directly on how he doesn't like this place, and he doesn't say it with any kind of levity either. Like, the poor kid sounds genuinely uneasy about his surroundings.
I don't think I like it here.
As well as that, there's also what has to be one of the cruelest jokes a level designer's ever come up with. And that's the one during a completely otherwise innocuous game mode involving an innocent round of miniature golf, where the player gets to putt through 9 holes with the various characters in all of these cutesy settings.
Yay!
However, if the player decides to venture off as Angelica and check out a nearby pyramid on the 8th hole, well, they'll find a reanimated mummy lurking in these darkened corridors. And yeah, because you're in like a labyrinth of tunnels here and the camera can be a sadistic bitch, trying to get away from this thing in a hurry ain't exactly a super quick or easy process.
Ice Cream Mountain, here I come!
But the most infamous one by far is the level where Stu short-circuits the power in the house. And Tommy takes it upon himself to get it back on, venturing downstairs in the dark and having to take on shadow monsters with a flashlight. with the very idea of the shadow monsters being instilled in his head by Stu earlier on.
That'll keep those shadow monsters away, champ.
Stu, you're going to frighten him.
It's like, yeah, thanks, Dad. And this whole thing is just oddly eerie and frightening, with the music being suitably dreary and all of the ghosts making these creepy distorted sounds when you get too close.
That'll keep those shadow monsters away.
Also, I guess we can close the book on where Remedy got their idea for Alan Wake from. Yeah, it seems the concept of defeating shadow monsters with a flashlight started with Search for Reptar. Even to this day, if you bring up the Rugrats games and Search for Reptar in particular, you're going to find no shortage of people reminiscing on the damage this game did to their psychological state all those years ago. Now, when it comes to that genre of open world survival, one of the all-time greats is without a doubt the original Subnautica. A game where you crash landed on an ocean planet and were left to fend for yourself, scavenging for resources and salvaging the ruined components of previous inhabitants to craft bigger and better tech. Despite its premise though, it's actually one of the most relaxing survival games ever made, dropping you into this literal ocean but letting you do things at your own pace, you know, as long as you've got enough air. And when you're just chilling out and building your little habitat, along with setting yourself up with all the essentials, it's actually kind of soothing. I mean, I could honestly spend the rest of my life here and really not give two shits about it. Then you start venturing deeper and deeper, coming across abandoned outposts that the ocean's now reclaimed, along with even weirder alien structures which serve an unknown purpose. And that dwindling air supply starts to become a very real and constant threat. While most of the local fauna are happy to leave you alone, there's a few aggressive species that very clearly don't like you and will attack you on sight. Firstly with the Leviathans, which really have the size and power to destroy even your biggest crafts with ease. To be honest though, like I've never really found these guys that scary. Really, I think they're more annoying than anything else just because of how hard they can be to avoid. It's those giant crab squids though, which utterly fucking terrify me. And I can still remember the first time I encountered one of these things, and how it just chose to lurk menacingly outside of the sunken outpost I'd hidden inside, just biding its time. I mean, just the visual of this thing alone is enough to make the hairs on the back of your neck and ball sack stand up. And yeah, to make them even more scary, their main method of attack is an EMP blast, which can even disable your crafts, making escape impossible. I also think a big part of why this element is so scary in Subnautica is because it just preys upon that universal fear that almost everyone has when it comes to the vastness of the ocean. And I don't know if it's some kind of evolutionary trait that we've just got ingrained in our DNA or something, but I think that everyone on some level has that deep-seated fear of the dark and open water. So seeing it brought to life in Subnautica in the form of these humongous otherworldly creatures really is about as pants-shittingly terrifying as it could ever get. Damn good stuff. Now, the Thief series has always been pretty good at putting in random little missions or sequences that would come out of nowhere to unnerve the player. Like in the first game, you'd have all those random little areas where there'd be zombies or other creatures lurking about. Plus, it also has what's easily one of the scariest missions in the entire series with the Haunted Cathedral. But the absolute peak of the franchise has to be the Shellbridge Cradle. Now, the story in the third game is that you're playing as returning Master Thief Garrett, investigating a prophecy for the Keepers that believes an evil figure is about to surface and cause some kind of new dark age of humanity.
It is as if someone actively seeks to bring the dark age upon us.
This eventually leads Garrett to the abandoned asylum/orphanage, the Shellbridge Cradle, which harbours some dark secrets from times long since past that might provide answers to his current plight. And if the simple premise of venturing into an abandoned asylum at night time wasn't scary enough, well, now consider that it's also teeming with its undead former inhabitants, along with it being haunted by the spirit of a little girl.
You did it!
It's also got one of my favourite cutscenes in the entire series, with Garrett chatting to a Hammerite inspector who relives these decades-old memories out in real time.
Unbent in evil apparition came from the darkness, near and
enough to touch, and my friend did scream.
Move, children! Vámonos!
Really setting the whole joint up as this mysterious and haunted place of dread.
'Tis the only place I dare spied her for certain, but I dare never return to that place.
That's a good place to start looking.
Now, to be fair, there were some pretty scary missions even before this, like the one on that ship called the Abysmal Gale that was overrun with zombies, along with that earlier mission inside a place called the Sunken Citadel, avoiding giant rat men and humanoid fish people. But I mean, up until that point, there was still some semblance of reality to everything that was going on. And most of the stuff you avoided was just other people, in castles, churches, or manors, you know, stuff like that.
Sounded like...
The Shellbridge Cradle, though, changed all of that up completely, and it really was the kind of thing that nightmares are fueled from. And the further you get into the Asylum, the more you start to see these undead inmates now skulking around, who, in a brilliant move by the level designers, even cause the nearby lights to flicker when they're close by. And also finding out that the Cradle is more or less a sentient being, and is choosing to keep Garrett there as a prisoner, never fails to put a chill down my spine. This whole level is just a masterclass on sound design and clever use of dynamic lighting. The kind of stuff that we really just don't see in gaming all that much anymore. So while people might have their issues with this third game for different reasons, I don't think anyone's really going to argue that this is the peak of the series, especially as far as the horror aspect goes. And even now, over 20 years later, it's still the kind of thing you just love to hate. Finally, we've got an all-time favourite of mine, and that's the Ocean House Hotel from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines.
How have you gotten this far?
Now, Bloodlines is easily one of the best unfinished games of all time, infamously rushed ahead to release due to issues over Valve's Source Engine, even having to compete with Half-Life 2, which launched the very same day. So to say that it came out to a rocky start is a bit of an understatement. And even now, like, it's easier to see all the cracks and blemishes, where Troika Games simply ran out of time or weren't able to work out all the kinks, even with this fan-made unofficial patch, which has more or less become essential. Still though, despite all of that, it's without a doubt the best vampire simulator ever made, letting you choose from one of 7 different clans, and then really crafting your own personal journey through this modern underworld.
I can see why this is so popular.
And you'd think for a game about vampires, werewolves, the supernatural and all that stuff, that the game would be chock full of frightening sequences.
Use your head and your eyes.
But in reality, oops, there goes gravity, most of Bloodlines was pretty tame.
Flatterer? No.
Unless you find the notion of having to navigate through a maze-like sewer system while you're both underarmed and under-leveled to be scary. In which case, yes, this shit is more terrifying than all of the Fatal Frames put together. Here though, it's the kind of horror, yet again with that Ocean House Hotel, that really comes out of nowhere. And this is the stuff that actually kind of gets ya, simply because you're really not prepared for any of it. Now this starts off as a pretty basic mission where you're given the task of heading to a supposedly haunted hotel to deal with a ghost that's being a bit of a nuisance to a construction crew. Before this, things have mostly been pretty hunky-dory, and you're given this mission pretty innocuously by Bloodlines poster girl, Jeanette. Yeah, the absolute perfect embodiment of don't stick your dick in crazy.
Really? Do I often pogo stick through your thoughts wearing nothing but a smile? Be honest. Or don't.
Why'd you take your pants off? My balls was hot. I understand.
Anyway, once you get there, it's night time, the place is deserted, and you're not even through the front door before paranormal activity starts kicking off, instantly putting you on edge. Entering the lobby, you start to see things out of the corner of your eye, along with even more poltergeist activity that really makes it clear you're not welcome. As you'll eventually discover, all of these hauntings are due to some kind of brutal murder that took place there years earlier, with the spirits of those involved still trapped in the hotel. Kinda bears a lot of similarities to The Shining with the whole hotel vibe, along with the premise of an axe-wielding murderer. And it really does feel like you're just making your way through some kind of by-the-numbers textbook haunted house, where each room has something different going on to try to make you jump out of your seat. However, that doesn't stop it from being a surprisingly effective sequence, and one that I was all too happy to see the back end of when all was said and done. And again, just keep in mind that this probably wasn't the intended version of what Troika had in mind with this mission, and the fact that they cooked this much on something that's probably still unfinished is kind of staggering. I mean, yeah, again, it might seem a bit piss weak by today's standards, but I guarantee you, if you speak to anyone who played this game back when it first launched, they're gonna regale you with their own personal story of how this mission caught them off guard. Well, either way, that's about it for the video.
Now that's what I like to hear.
And I hope that if nothing else, I at least gave people a few good reasons to go back and play some of these games, if only to check this shit out for themselves. If you can think of any other games with incidental horror sequences in them that I might have missed, well, also be sure to let me know in the comments section below. And as always, thanks for watching.